everyone. Delighted to have you here today, and especially delighted to have our guest speaker, Ken Weintraub. Ken has a wonderful bio here that I'll just sort of highlight. He is a graduate of the State University of New York in Binghamton, received his master's in social work at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. He has worked primarily in the Jewish communal field, and he is the past CEO of our local Jewish community centers. He spent a lot of years fundraising. He's a history buff, and I believe we were talking to think, now, how did we learn about Ken? And it was through a program that a few years ago we participated in called Lifelong Learning, which is one of Washington University's non-credit programs that they hold, and that's where we met. So I'm really excited. I won't say anything more, but just ask Ken to please take it away. And please, everyone, silence your phones. Thank you.
Thank you, Vi. Good afternoon, everyone. All right. Wow, am I glad to be here. I wasn't sure what the crowd would be. 10, 15 minutes ago, I look around, I saw 3-4 people. I look around again, I see 40 or more. So I don't know if it's me, the way my wife dressed me this morning, or just a good place to be on a Monday afternoon. How many of you were born, raised, or lived a good chunk of your lives in St. Louis? Show of hands. Almost all of you. Now, I've been here 40 years, so I feel like a native with one exception. I didn't go to high school here. So I don't have that specific piece of dialogue that I can add. My wife went to U City, class of 1968. If there are any U City alumni, I'll bring that to her attention. But, and my father-in-law was East St. Louis High School back in 1938. My mother-in-law was Soldan High School, Soldan Blewett, around 1940, and on. So I feel connected. I love St. Louis. And what we're going to do in the next 20 minutes or so, and then leave enough time for Q&A, is sort of a panorama from 1950, 5 years after the end of World War II, when St. Louis was at its apex in size, in economic power, population, and yet the seeds for a lot of that to be chipped away were already underneath the surface. And we're going to talk about that as well. But let's take a look at where we were in 1950. We were the 8th largest metropolitan area in city in the country, the United States. Now, as a city, 35th. Yes. Now, and we'll talk about why in just a moment. The biggest part, and we'll get to it, is why, but during World War II, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt called for America to become the arsenal of democracy, St. Louis was ready. We had, at that point, over 800,000 people in the city alone, right after Pearl Harbor. And the threats from the Nazis in Germany, who declared war on us one day after Japan's attack in 1941. And we had an industrial complex already there. What were some of the big factories that had begun even in the 1920s, manufacturing cars, car accessories? Who can remember? On Union Boulevard, we had the second largest Chevrolet plant in the country. And by 1943, they were manufacturing airplanes, B-29, B-17s, B-29s, second only to Willow Run in Detroit, as an example. Carter Carburetor, and the list went on. Let's take a look. We were at the crossroads of America. During the war, after Detroit, we were the arsenal of democracy. Literally, right up from bullets to airplanes to part of the nuclear materials that were built in Weldon Springs, Missouri, as part of the ultra top secret Manhattan Project. But then, between 48 and 50, Ford Motor invested in a huge plant in Hazelwood, Missouri, right off of Lindbergh Boulevard. We had the great General Motors plant that by 1953 had invented the Corvette, the most famous sports car in United States manufacturing history, was right here in North St. Louis. McDonnell Douglas. Think of what McDonnell Douglas accomplished. The Mercury program. Forget the great jet planes that defended North America, but President Kennedy himself came here in August of 1961 to personally inspect the Mercury program and what was going to become the Apollo. McDonnell Douglas was #1, and they were an incredible St. Louis company. Carburetor, the #1 manufacturer of automotive carburetors, long before catalytic converters basically replaced the carburetor. Carter was based here. Washington Avenue. Did you know that we were the second largest manufacturer of men's, women's, and children's clothing in North America? Bigger than Dallas, bigger than Los Angeles, bigger than San Francisco, bigger than Philly or Baltimore, second only to 7th Avenue in New York. But we had manufacturing women's wear, Missy Lane as an example. To this day, one of the 2 or 3 largest ladies' undergarments manufacturer in the country, if I could say that with due respect. But we made ties, we made hats, Singer Hat Company, and on and on. And we were also, remember, first in shoes, first in booze, but last in the American League. Because, do you remember? You're right. We had 2 for 50 years. From 1950 to 53, we had 2 Major League Baseball teams. What was the American League franchise? The St. Louis Browns. And to this day, they are housed, in Baltimore, Maryland, but they still wear the brown and white colors forever. But Brown Shoe Company, as a little boy, I knew about Buster Brown shoes. And by the way, I should have mentioned Ralston Purina, Checkerboard Square. I would say to my mother in 1953, Mommy, I want my rice checks or my wheat checks with bananas and Seal Test milk. I remember the great Seal Test Dairy just west of St. Louis Union Station. We had the largest and busiest railroad terminal in the United States during the war years and in the immediate years after. A sidebar, my mother from my hometown of Buffalo had been going out with my father since 1939. Well, my father is deep in basic training in Fort Bliss, Texas. in El Paso, and he wanted to elope. One of the thousands and thousands of wartime proposals. My mother had never been 50 miles outside of Buffalo. She was scared. A 24-year-old living at home, wondering what to do. My grandparents, in their Yiddish accent, they said, Rosamund, the bum has been courting you for 4 years. Go down there, here's the train fare, and get it. Well, my mother was scared. She went to the Buffalo Central Terminal, got on the New York Central, and 18 hours later, she arrives in St. Louis Union Station. But she was frightened. Again, her only boyfriend, who she knew would soon be going over to Europe. Well, so she finds a payphone, calls collect, of course, and her father answered. And my mother said, Pa, I'm scared. I want to get the next train back to Buffalo. And he said, my grandpa David Becker said, Rosamund, the bum is waiting for you in El Paso. Get there, find a rabbi, you'll get married, and live happily ever after. Well, they had a few bumps in the road, but they were married till death did them part. But, so a little bit, now, if my mother had gotten permission to turn around, Jen, somebody else would be doing this presentation today. I can guarantee you that. But think of the might just going downtown in St. Louis during the war years and after. And I know all of you are too young to remember, but you heard stories from your parents. The great shoe companies. Look, International Shoe is now the city museum, but at least the building stands. Brown Shoe has been sold and resold, but an amazing legacy. And Washington Avenue was Fashion Avenue. We had very strong unions, from the United Auto Workers to steel workers to the trades, particularly construction. We had a dynamic downtown. Just think, go back to a Saturday morning in December. What great department stores would you go to on the streetcar or the bus down Delmar or Olive or Kings Highway or Grand Avenue, and then transfer perhaps on Market Street and get off at 7th, walk a block north? What was the most famous department store in the Midwest? It was Famous and Bar. And then, what was two of its rivals? All right? And if you answer correctly, I'll come back next week. Sticks, Bear, and Fuller, and Scruggs. Right. But where did you go? What was the 5 and dime that you got the best ice cream sundae in the world? What was it? F.W. Woolworths. Absolutely. Which, by the way, was the Woolworth family was originally from my hometown, but they expanded to be the #1 5 and dime. Oh, the smell of those places. Remember the peanuts and the like? And talk about great retail on Kings Highway North and then Kings Highway South. You had the greatest retailer in North America, Sears, Roebuck and Company, in those great yellow brick buildings. Oh, and the smell of those roasted peanuts and almonds when you walked in. Then you bought your tires. So, all right. And remember, first in booze, we meant beer. Budweiser, no Bud Light then, it was the real thing, the king of beers. Yet, Falstaff was the #1 brand. Now, I'm sure everybody waited till at least their 25th birthday before having their first brewski. But and as a kid, I would watch the CBS baseball game of the week in the middle 1950s. And who were the announcers but Dizzy Dean and Buddy Blattner from St. Louis. And they were sponsored by St. Louis Beers. And you were the bowling capital of the country. The great Budweiser, I can remember 65, 60 years ago, those great bowlers from St. Louis. Don Carter, Dick Weber, Ray Bluth, Billy Whaley, and, somebody's going to help the 5th member of the great Budweiser's bowling team. We saw them every week around the country. Pat Patterson. Yes, sir. All right. And Griesedek Brothers. Beer was flowing in the streets. And the Anheuser-Busch Brewery, thank God, within its buyout, stands as the North American headquarters for InBev Anheuser-Busch. I still don't like the sound of that. All right? St. Louis had a population of 860,000 in 1950. 8th largest. Bigger than Houston. Bigger than Dallas. Bigger than Memphis. Indianapolis. Minneapolis, or St. Paul. But what inhibited its future expansion as a city was the city-county divorce of 1876, when the city fathers of that era feared that the farmers in rural St. Louis wanted to take over and rob the resources of the great city. That by then, St. Louis had become the 4th largest city in the United States. And they were very happy to keep its borders along Skinker Avenue, and then south below Carondelet, and north as well. And there was an official divorce that limited St. Louis County to be the farmland. Well, big mistake. Because look at all the tax dollars that were lost, the development, because it wasn't the Iron Curtain where people couldn't move out during the great expansions of after the war, and we're going to get into that. White flight. And this was in every city in the country. In November of 1944, at the height of battles in Europe and the Pacific, the Congress and Franklin Roosevelt signed it, maybe the most single important piece of domestic legislation in our history, the GI Bill of Rights. How many of you lived in a GI mortgage home when growing up? Anyone? I see a few hands. I did. Okay. How many of your mother's fathers, aunts, or uncles after the war went to college free of charge? No tuition. I had relatives. I see a hand. It was incredible. And more hands are going up. Suddenly, what had been an undereducated country, by 1950, on every campus in the country were the Quonset huts, housing the GIs and their new brides and their little babies. I am right at the heart of the baby boom being born in 1950. And the country was literally exploding with growth. Human, educational, and fiscal. The housing industry allowed inexpensive mortgages through the GI Bill, and developers met those needs. The farmlands go back to 1876. Now, beyond University City to the west, Olivet. What was Olivet before the war? farmland, Creve Coeur, Baldwin, and then the areas south along the perimeter of 270 and north, the areas like Jennings, Ferguson, Hazelwood. They were low density, sparse housing, some industrial, and farms. 3 decades later, a totally different look. But the tax income and revenues and growth were in these areas and not in the once powerful city of St. Louis. African Americans, unfortunately, the compromises that Roosevelt had to accept from the deep Southern senators and congressmen was to discriminate against blacks getting the full benefits of the GI Bill and to benefit from fair housing. So, the reason why this is important about economics is blacks were basically redlined. It's a bad term that realtors used in North City, in pockets in which meant that they couldn't create new housing because, as we know, for most Americans, any wealth that we possess is generated by housing and the equity of our homes as we hold on to them and grow them. And a significant portion of the population around the country could not benefit. Industries began moving to non-union states because they could, particularly in the aircraft, construction industries, electronics. Suddenly, sleepy southern towns like a Birmingham, the Memphis, and very importantly, the great state of Texas, and we have some former Texas residents in the room, Houston, which had a smaller population of only 500,000 in 1950, by 1960 had 1.2 million. Today, over 4 million. Oil and gas. And an industry that was created in my neck of the woods, one of the coldest places in the United States, air conditioning. The Carrier Company was from Syracuse, New York, 140 miles east of where I grew up. But without air conditioning, Dallas, Houston, Phoenix, LA would have been a shell of what itself. The city and county had minimal unity and planning, desire, and expertise. Lambert, what was a great airport. Remember the days 45 years ago where there were 2 flights daily to Paris, non-stop from here, when TWA had its hub here. We had every major airline imaginable. Lambert was the pride of the Midwest. Now, and I lived in Minneapolis and St. Paul, mid-70s to mid-80s. Go to their airport and see it is now what Lambert should have been. Why was Lambert hindered? Because no formal county relationship. They have been at odds for the most part, no coordination, no lawmaking regional council of governments that could say the city needs help. The city cannot do it alone. This is not 1904 anymore. And we've suffered because I can name a bunch of cities where there is unified planning. Louisville, Kentucky, the Jefferson County Unified School District, which did much more in integration. Nashville, Memphis, Dallas, Houston, Birmingham, and so many more cities and counties and states created merged planning efforts. So our dominance in so many industries, as we're going to see, began falling off. Mergers and sales of top companies over the last 20 to 30 years. The May Company, stretching from Los Angeles to Cleveland, from St. Louis to Houston. A great, great chain, headquartered in the Railway Exchange Building, which right now is literally falling apart at 7th and Olive, housed by rats and vagrants. It's a sin, and hopefully it will be remedied. But they sold out to Macy's. They weren't merged, they were bought out. Southwestern Bell moves to San Antonio 30 years ago. You've got that great tower, the second tallest skyscraper in St. Louis, has been vacant for 10 years. The proud Southwestern Bell 1980s annex to that beautiful original Southwestern Bell. Well, now it's AT&T. But again, Southwestern Bell was based in St. Louis. It was the dominant Midwest and Southern phone company. I mentioned the May Company, Anheuser-Busch. Oh, when they were sold in 1998, it was this little brewery out of Belgium with some Brazilian investment that borrowed money from around the world for $58 billion. $58 billion. It was like the mouse that swallowed the elephant. They had the money to buy the equity because the Bush family was ready to cash out. So suddenly, this little dinky brewery in Belgium buys out the greatest brewery that this nation had ever seen, Anheuser-Busch. Monsanto, the bottom left picture, the world's leader in chemicals and in innovation, sells out to a German company, Bayer. Yes, I take an 81 milligram Bayer aspirin every night, and I'm glad it exists. But I didn't want it to take over Monsanto, but it did. Remember that made those 1948 Mercuries that were bigger than the USS Enterprise battleships. Oh, God. And, God, I used to love those cars. My father, every year, in his prosperous years, would get a new Oldsmobile. Oh, the Oldsmobile 88s. I'm seeing some smiles and nods. And remember those Buicks? I mean, those things maybe got 2 miles per gallon, but who cared? Polluted the air, and talk about safety or lack thereof. Particularly the Chrysler products. They had the points coming out like pyramids out of the steering wheel. God forbid somebody ran into you. You were gone, but you didn't care. You ran into the chrome, and bingo, and the smell. Remember the smell when you went into those great car dealers on Kings Highway? Oh, that was America that I remembered as a kid. Going to the smell of a new car, the chrome, the aluminum. And you didn't think of safety at that point. Seatbelts? I don't know how I'm still around. I think I was 3 months old. They threw me at the front seat to go to the drive-in restaurant. But we did. But the Chrysler factory, the great complex built in the 70s along in Fenton, Missouri, no longer here. Subdivided into little industrial parks. The Ford Motor Company, those great 1948 Mercuries, bigger than spaceships, gone. McDonnell Douglas sold, not merged, sold to Boeing. Yes, thank God, Boeing kept the defense component of McDonnell Douglas, and if that had gone, we would really be in rough economic and employment shape. Now, we look at the companies that have left. Just a sampling. Stixbury Fuller, bought out by Dillard's. An Arkansas, Little Rock, Arkansas company. Central Hardware. Who went with mom or dad to Central Hardware? All right, I see almost everyone from scoop to nuts, remember? All right, Rothman Furniture. The Gem department stores. If mom or dad worked in a governmental agency, it was like the Costco of the 1960s. You had a membership to a Gem store. Bowman's Bank, the biggest and finest lending institution in town. Look at that upper left picture. The Edison Brothers Warehouse. Baker Shoes, Chandler Shoes, and on. Gone. A.G. Edwards, one of the largest brokerage houses in the nation. And St. Louis Globe Democrat, the conservative voice in St. Louis, but it was whether you agreed with them politically or not, it was a fun newspaper. They had the best columnists, the best gossip, and the best sports pages, led by its editor, Bob Burns. All right? And then, lower left, Sportsman's Park at Grand and Dodier. How many ever made a trip there? Well, there's a chance that before the year is out, maybe I'll sneak in and I'm going to do a program on the history of ballpark food. Peanuts, popcorn, Cracker Jack, that's your Red Hots, when they didn't cost $8. They cost 25 cents with all the mustard you could slather on it. The great, no wonder I got a double bypass, but it was worth it. Don't tell my cardiologist that, please. But the franchises that we've lost, the St. Louis Browns to Baltimore, the St. Louis Rams back to LA, and one of the greatest professional basketball teams that we had that played in the Kiel Auditorium from 1954 to 1970, 68. Who were they? The St. Louis Hawks. Who is their great star? Big Blue from LSU, 6'9", Bob Pettit, who is still with us, by the way, and comes to St. Louis for charity events. Loved his time in St. Louis, but I miss pro basketball. Now, all is not lost. We have been a fountain of tech money. The new 21st century industries, artificial intelligence, technology, the computer age, post-computer age. We can go particularly to Midtown in St. Louis and see some of the old factories that used to make buttons, materials, clothing, and the like are now sources for biotech, the Cortex, that area between Wash U and SLU, have now young kids that are not dressed in suits and ties like Dad did when he would get in his 1954 Oldsmobile to go to work downtown at the Shell building and as an accountant or bookkeeper or to sell insurance for General American. No, the kids today are geniuses, but they dress like they fell off a truck. And I'm sorry, I'm old-fashioned. I wore a sport coat because of this group today. And, well, thank you, all right? And my name tag, and, you know, the Yiddish phrase, like a mensch, like a good boy. So, the Danforth Plant Center, a few miles northeast of here, in the Olivet Creve Coeur line. Wonderful investments. And thank God the federal government chose us to have in North St. Louis the new National Geospatial Center, which is developed by the U.S. government, which is going to be the mapping center for all of our defense forces in St. Louis. Education. We need more of it. We need new funding structures for public schools. And I purposely put St. Louis Community College. We need our state of Missouri. We need our counties and the city to invest more in education. Those competitive states that I mentioned, I'm very familiar with Minnesota. The taxes are higher, but you get what you pay for. Great public schools, great community colleges, an amazing Big Ten university within the city limits of Minneapolis and St. Paul. UMSL is growing, but it needs more financial support from the state. As an example, St. Louis University, the second largest Catholic university in the United States, after Notre Dame. Yes, SLU, a wonderful institution, is having to rely on the private sector for its support. Washington University is by far the most prosperous and prestigious, but now in a new era of competition for resources, even mighty WashU is going to have to face it. We have a terrific infrastructure left over from mid-century to educate kids. But we've got to start with the kindergartners, the preschoolers, from the poorest neighborhoods in this region to the wealthiest, so we can get them to these universities and other fine schools, like Lindenwood as an example, and others, so that we can have an educated workforce that compares with our rivals to the north, east, south, and west. What can St. Louis do to recapture the standing we talked about a half hour ago that we had in 1950? First in shoes, first in booze, second in automobiles, second in fashion, first in chemical production, and on and on. What more does St. Louis need to accomplish to regain its past economic power? Should governments be more united and coordinated? If any of these points resonate with you, then bring them up. See, am I wrong? Have I made a little bit of sense? Have I maybe opened up our eyes? We have a lot of good people in this area, 2.4 million of us, from Illinois to Wentzville, to Jefferson County, Franklin County, the northern suburbs, and the like. People who work here, people who reside here. But we have challenges, starting to face them. But we have to have a willpower, we have to have money invested, in my estimation, because I want my grandchildren maybe to move here someday and be part of the legacy and the growth, because this is my adopted hometown and I am not leaving. You have been a most gracious, fun audience to be with. Jen and Vi and Mary, thank you all for inviting me, and I hope to see all of you again in the near future. Thank you.
The campus of motor manufacturing, with 5 motor manufacturers.
All right, so let's give him one more round of applause. Ken, he will be back. Did anybody have any questions for Ken?
Yeah.
Hold on.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Oh,
Yeah, I have a question. We have some of us who work for Wagner Electric.
Sure.
And when I worked there was 6,600 people working there in Ralston, 39 buildings. And then I worked at Emerson Electric, and then there was Century Electric. So St. Louis was the world's largest producer of electric motors with 5 motor manufacturing plants.
That's right.
So that was one of the huge facilities, Trent Motors, electric motors, the world, they're largest producers of motors in the world. Isn't that right, Walt?
Yeah.
Yep.
Wow, I'm sorry I forgot about
So I would
Wagner.
just-
I'm familiar. I appreciate that. Anything else? Anything else that I may have left out? Please.
Because of the central
Yeah,
main offices, there are a lot of ancillary companies
right.
that support them.
Sure.
That's no longer here. Neuter Boiler Company
Right.
is one example. And it goes on
Yeah, you're
and on, and also left that we do
Yeah.
business
Oh,
with.
there's another
Yeah,
transformer plant.
ancillary businesses, distributors for the big plants, particularly the big auto plants. But tax incentives made by more aggressive state governments, like in Texas, which, except for the General Motors plant outside of Dallas, is almost a totally non-union state. But yet they incentivize General Motors to come down there. And in Dallas, to have one of their 3 or 4 largest auto plants. We could do this again. We've got the land available. I've driven in South City recently. There are tracts of vacant lots that used to be factories that are just waiting for redevelopment. I'm optimistic that we can. Any other companies that I may have missed, or recreational place? Sir?
This isn't a company per se,
Yeah.
but an industry. Banking, for example.
Sure.
In the early days, or younger days, you had a community bank in every municipality.
Yes.
And it was staffed by people who lived and worked in the area, and they knew the area.
Yes.
So you had decisions being made locally rather than New York or Chicago or something like that. I think that's missed.
I really agree with you. Now, decisions on loans are made by algorithms on a computer. And the mergers, the buyouts of the great banks that we've talked about, and I alluded to Boltman's as an example, but I don't recognize the names. And there's a new bank every week, but they're not local, like Simmons. They're fine people, but you are so right. You knew the man or woman that was authorizing the loan. Other examples? Well,
The Globe newspaper.
the Globe. Yes,
We
absolutely.
said it, but the sports and everything that came from Martin and Ray Dugan.
Right.
He knows Donnybrook and all that.
Donnybrook, right.
These, we don't have this.
No,
Not like it used to be.
you don't have the opposing voice. Exactly. Whether you agree with the Post or not, it needs an alternative. And the Globe Democrat did. Phyllis Schwab, the Eagle Forum and on. But you don't have that in print anymore.
Or the St. Louis Star.
Right.
Newspaper.
Sure. In the St. Louis Times with Sid Keener as the lead sports editor. Absolutely, we had 4 newspapers here as recently as 1950, and dailies. And I'm a newspaper junkie. I may be the last person on earth that still subscribes to the Post 7 days a week, Wall Street Journal on Saturday, and the New York Times on Sunday. Most of my friends, my contemporaries, and my son and daughter-in-law don't know from print anymore. Everything is this. But I love newspapers. And I'm going to tell a secret. I'm a baby boomer who grew up with television. And even when we had no money, every week, the little bound issue of TV Guide, beginning in 1954, came to my house. it still comes to my house on Leisure Lane in Creve Coeur to this day. I am a almost 70-year subscriber through my parents and myself, and my wife thinks I'm nuts, and she's correct. But I get my TV Guide in print. So there you go, sir. I'm glad you brought up the Globe. All right.
Where to from here?
Pardon?
Where to from here?
No, I originally grew up back east in Buffalo, New York.
For this area, how are we going to get out of this mess?
Oh,
Yeah, you didn't tell us.
well, if I knew all the answers, I'd probably be elsewhere. No, but what could be better than being at Mason Pointe? I can't imagine. No, seriously, what's going to happen is, first of all, a unifying thread of governments. City and county, one way or another, are going to have to come together.
Right.
This is crazy, the way we have the haves, the have-nots. Other regions have done it. We need to, we have to have a unified airport. And we could get trains coming again, a great new train terminal, because trains are going to be coming back in fashion. And then we have to have the unions and big business getting together to actively recruit businesses. High tech, low tech, old industry, and the like. But to me, the answer, one word, I'll say it 3 times: unity, unity, unity. Among all the dividing forces that we have, we can be very comfortable living in my unincorporated area just north of Creve Coeur, particularly if I get the snow plowed a couple times a year. But it's not going to facilitate growth that we need for the next generations. We need increased school funding. We need more money for infrastructure. We have the lowest cigarette tax. We don't grow an acre of tobacco in this state, and yet we have the lowest cigarette tax. I think everybody can agree cigarettes ain't good things. Not that hot dogs are, but cigarettes are further down the tin. We have the lowest tobacco tax in the country. If we increased it to what Mississippi has, we could be doing great things for mental health, for education. I'm talking about deep South states that were members of the Confederacy that grow tobacco. North Carolina has a far stronger, with the same population, educational system than we do. And that's just with the tobacco tax alone. It's ridiculous. And by the way, don't get me started on the personal property tax, which to this day, and I've been here 40 years, I don't understand. You pay a sales tax, which is hefty, and then every January you get another comparable sales tax, and we advertise ourselves as a low-tax state. Well, I have a phrase from the streets of Buffalo I could say to that, but I won't, because I'm at Mason Pointe, and I don't use nasty phrases. But you know what I'm talking about. This personal property tax. Get a legitimate income tax that is, it's not a dirty word always, progressive, that the more you make, the more you pay, but not exorbitantly. Those are my answers, sir, to your question.
Thank you.
Well, I do hope to see you guys again, and we'll deal with fun subjects, patriotic subjects, the best of American history, and 3 cheers for Mason Pointe.
Oh, thank you, Ken.
If it's brought loud and long, we can maybe
want some.
entice him to come
Yeah.
back again, right? Thank you.
All right, good. I'll be here for a couple minutes if anybody wants to say.
Awful concern. You